Hello, everybody, and happy holidays. Welcome to this special Blue Shield of California Facebook Live event. The topic today is loneliness. I'm your host, Karina Nova, anchor and reporter here at ABC 7 News. And we're talking about health and mental health, which are topics that I believe are so important to our viewers. So I'm so honored and excited to talk about this with you today with the help of Dr. Jennifer Christian-Herman, Vice President of the MindBody Medicine team at Blue Shield. Welcome, Jennifer. I'm excited to have this conversation with you today and share a lot of great information with our Facebook viewers.
No, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it as well. It's such an important topic and highlighted most recently by our own Surgeon General in his report calling this a public health pandemic. So excited to be having this discussion today.
Well, we talked about it in the introduction. You are a great person to discuss the topic of loneliness. You're a mind body expert. We'll get into parts of that Surgeon General report throughout this conversation. But I wanted to first get right to the heart of the issue. How do you define loneliness? What is loneliness? Can you explain that?
Sure. It's really important to know what we're talking about, right? So loneliness is when you have subjective distress around your feeling of social connection or lack of social connection in your life. So it's not some measure that you should have X number of people or X number of friendships, but it's really how you feel about it. Are you distressed? Do you feel like you have the social connections that you need to feel fulfilled in life? So that is different from social isolation, which is when you actually could count and say this individual has this many contacts or connections in their life. People can be very content with a very small social network, or people can actually have a pretty big social network and in fact feel lonely.
And there are different groups who are impacted. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, I guess anyone can experience loneliness, right?
Sure. Yeah. So you're right. So, the thing that was really striking to me in the Surgeon General report is even before COVID, we think about COVID as such a defining marker, but even before COVID, 1 in every 2 individuals reported having periods of loneliness. So this is something that we are all experiencing. And we do see at higher rates in certain segments of our population, particularly in youth, so adolescents, and also in older individuals. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about COVID and the impact of COVID and now coming out of COVID, but we definitely have seen some changes and different impacts related to that time that we've experienced.
Yeah, and we'll get to how COVID played a role in this loneliness epidemic here in a moment. But the US Surgeon General did call it an epidemic. It is such a prevalent thing here in the United States that Dr. Ruth, remember Dr. Ruth, famous for being a sex expert? I think she's well into her 90s now, but she has recently been officially named as the US Ambassador for Loneliness. So they are focusing on this. The U.S. Surgeon General wants to help people so they're not lonely because we do know the impacts of it, physically, mentally, all of that, as you've been talking about. So let's discuss that a little bit. Are there telltale signs of loneliness?
Sure. And I love you bringing up Dr. Ruth. And I would say there are a number of other countries that actually have ministers of loneliness or ambassadors of loneliness. And I think it speaks to the fact that A, this is such a common condition, but B, the profound impact it has, the impact it has on individuals, which I know we'll talk a little bit about, but also the impact on our society, on healthcare costs. So I think it is something that there are it's going to take a village to address this. So it's something that we want to think about the role that all these different organizations, whether it's healthcare, whether it is, community supports, whether it's, parents or schools or workplaces, that we all can play a role in addressing loneliness. So with that, you asked a question. I forgot the actual question.
Yeah, the question is, what are some signs that you might be lonely or someone else might be lonely? Because it's not one of those things we talk about, really. You talk about signs for depression or anxiety, things like that. But loneliness, can you talk about that a little?
Sure. And I think you're right. I mean, I think when we look at the signs, we might say, oh, that person, they're in they're married, or they're in a, have a life partner. They have, other family members around. They have a job where they interact with people. Oh, they aren't lonely. I'm going to focus on this person. When in fact, again, you can be in these relationships and feel profoundly lonely if you're not getting the kind of connection or support that you need. So I think it's good to look out for people in our lives that we may be concerned about. And I think sometimes things like, people in times of transition. I have a neighbor whose spouse just died. I know that she's alone over the holidays. So, not to presume that she is in fact lonely, but to check in, to have those conversations. But I think it's, because it really is, loneliness is in the eye of the beholder. It's good to have those conversations, whether you're concerned about someone or if you yourself are lonely. I think that you're right. A lot of stigma around mental health, thankfully, and other things. We really saw a decrease in that during the time of COVID because we were sort of all in it together. And I think with loneliness, we did a lot during COVID to be aware of, like, wow, we don't have the social connections we have. But I think coming out of that period, just to recognize that people may still be struggling, and it's good to have that conversation if you're concerned about someone, or to find your words to have that conversation if you yourself need more support.
Well, as you mentioned COVID right now, let's talk about that. We know that loneliness existed before COVID. There's no doubt that the pandemic had a profound impact on loneliness in the United States for people of all age groups, right? You saw teenagers, you saw young kids who felt like they weren't connected to their classmates, teenagers, people in their 20s and 30s who were used to at least going into work and socializing. They were secluded at home. What kind of role do you think COVID played in this loneliness epidemic? And I guess, how do you think it changed how we experience loneliness?
Yeah. So, I mean, it was such an unprecedented time, and definitely we saw increases in rates of loneliness. And I think there was a little less stigma. We were comfortable talking about, feeling isolated, feeling lonely. At times there was sort of a sense of camaraderie, like, how can we connect virtually? Let's do our book club online. Let's, do these activities online. So I think it was really normalized then. And we know, conversely, I mean, that was sort of the upside. I think the downside is we know it really impacted certain groups. So definitely youth, whether it was younger students, younger individuals, and also high school students, who missed a lot of the sort of developmental social things that happen with being at school. And I think although loneliness and depression and mental health challenges are different things, they definitely can be interconnected. And I think we saw a real increase in the prevalence of depression, anxiety, et cetera, in young people during COVID, and now as we've come out of it. So I think youth were particularly impacted in terms of loneliness, and also older adults who were very, very careful generally around exposure during COVID, but also might not have had some of the other, like, digital and other technology ways of connecting with others. So it was a really isolating period. Then now coming out of COVID, I think it's really, people are in very different places. I think for some people it was I'm going to jump back into all of my activities and and have all those social contacts again. And so maybe people are feeling less lonely. But for some groups, this new normal is really a new normal. It's not just jumping back to how things were. And so it may be that those normal social structures that people, participated in, volunteer activities or other things, some of those things may have changed. And so people may still be hesitant, and or what they did before may not look the same now. And people may feel lonely, but also less likely to speak up because we're not all in it together now. We're all in pretty different places now that we've emerged from that time of isolation.
I'm going to follow up because something just came to mind. I mean, during the pandemic, I feel like some of us realized we actually like our time to ourselves. We don't mind being away from people. We don't necessarily enjoy going into work and socializing. How do you know when loneliness is a choice and when it's something that's beyond that, where it is not good for you, when it's bad for your mental health?
Yeah, no, I think that's so important. And I think there's, we don't want to point to someone and say like, gee, you should be lonely or you must be lonely. You don't have those things. I think there's some people, that people are, more introverted or extroverted. And so some people you could be very content, enjoy your own company, have other activities or things that you do. And with a small social network, feel really content. And that's okay. So I think that's it's not a one size fits all. And but to recognize that if what you feel doesn't feel like it's enough in terms of social connection, that's when it has these negative, physical health and mental health impacts. So that being comfortable being alone, or and even prefer being alone, that's okay as long as it's not distressing to you.
That's good to know. Let's go back to senior citizens. That subset of the population seem to be the most vulnerable. Do you think that senior loneliness is worse here in the United States than, say, other countries? I remember seeing, places like Japan. There are areas where, senior citizens, they get together and they garden together and they share their crops, and things like that. I mean, it's part of the societal structure that's in place for seniors to continue thriving. It doesn't necessarily seem like that's being done here.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think there's also often differences in sort of family and living structures here compared to other places in the world where multi-generational families will live together or live near each other. And here, often seniors are living away from family, and that's another isolating factor. Fewer people in your day-to-day life, and fewer people to check in on you and help you make those connections.
Right. You mentioned briefly about the mental health effects of loneliness. Let's get into that a little bit more. Tell us about the mental health side.
Sure. And also maybe speak a little bit about the physical health impact too. So
Right.
definitely, so in terms of, first of all, let me say some really startling statistics from the Surgeon General report. So if you are in a state of loneliness, chronic loneliness, the impact on your health is profound. So you have higher rates of risk for cardiovascular disease, for diabetes, for all kinds of health conditions. They actually equate it to the impact of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So being lonely has a bigger impact on your physical health than your level of physical activity, your diet, etc. So that is really startling and shocking. And it definitely has an impact on your mental health. So I think I said earlier, loneliness is not depression. Loneliness is not a mental health condition, but the two can definitely be interconnected. So having ongoing chronic loneliness can certainly be associated with developing depression. That it's not a good state to be in, and it can really impact your mood in terms of developing a clinical condition. Conversely, having symptoms of certain mental health conditions like depression, that being isolated is actually a symptom of that. And so definitely if you're feeling down, you don't have a lot of energy, it is even harder to do those things, to make the step to make social connections. So they really reinforce each other. And I think that is, when we think about like, I'm feeling lonely, what can I do? Or that person is lonely, what can they do? To also recognize that there may be other things going on that make it particularly hard to sort of pull yourself out of it and just find a way to connect.
Right. And, we have the holidays coming up right around the corner. There's so much, you know, talk around this time, being with friends and family, getting out there, enjoying the holidays. I feel like there are sensitivities to loneliness during this time of year. Would you agree?
I definitely would agree. And we see, again, I've said those things are different, but I think we certainly see increases in the rates of depression and other mental health symptoms during the holidays. I think there is, an expectation sometimes that it should be just a joyful time, and it's not always a joyful time for people. If the things that people you normally would connect with, or the things that you might have done historically, you're not able to do, there's a sense of loss of that. And just even the expectation, like, well, this should be this time. It's not that way for me. So I think it's important to acknowledge that if that's what you're feeling, and to think about ways that you can take care of yourself. And that may be, reaching out and finding something to do. I'm going to go volunteer on, on Christmas or over Hanukkah or whatever holiday is, I celebrate or is difficult for me if I'm alone. There are plenty of other things that you can do. I think we'll touch on that a little bit, but I think just being aware of that and taking care of yourself and doing what you can to plan something. So if you know it's going to be a difficult time, you have some options and some things to do to help address that.
Yeah, that's some good advice. And, we've talked a lot about the signs of being lonely and who might be vulnerable and why. Let's dive into what we all can do to help, right? You mentioned what we can do to help ourselves, but let's start with a family member, a coworker, a friend. If you notice someone may be lonely, what are some things to consider and what are some things that we can do to help?
Sure. So I think one thing is just to have the conversation, just to ask if someone's feeling lonely, not to reinforce some stigma that someone might have by tiptoeing around the issue. So that's important. I think there are so many things that we can do individually, but also we can't solve for someone else. So, we can ask if someone would like, would you like thinking about my neighbor for a moment, what are you doing over the holidays? Are you, I know maybe a hard year. Do you want to come join us? This is what we're doing. So I think making those invitations. There's also some interesting research showing that actually asking someone to help you. So you're not in the role of like, let me help save you from your loneliness, but asking someone, hey, can you help me volunteer at this, food service activity over the holidays? Can you help me through this animal rescue I'm involved in? They're looking for fosters for animals over the holidays to get them out of the shelter. So I think, finding ways that you can involve people, but also ask for their help, that may be an easier path for someone to step out of their comfort zone a bit and engage. And I would say similarly, if you're the person feeling lonely, not to be ashamed of that, to feel free to raise that with people in your lives, and to seek out those activities, again, whether it's volunteer service, whether it's, bringing an animal into your life temporarily or adopting an animal, et cetera, or there's so many things that individuals can do, but also just not to be ashamed of feeling lonely, and that you want to have more social contact in your life. That's a human instinct.
Yeah, some things might not work out. And then, a couple tries later of trying to join a group or volunteer, it might be the right fit. As we wrap things up here, we're going to put a series of resources that are out there for the people that are watching right now that might be dealing with loneliness, either themselves or loved ones. So we'll put that in the comments below. But Jennifer, can you just give us a couple of big takeaways as we wrap up this great conversation here?
Sure. So I would say, the first is this desire to connect with others or have social connectedness is just profoundly human. So, it looks different for everyone, but if you are lacking that, don't have shame around that. Really try to take that step to have that conversation, or at least that recognition in yourself that I really want more social connection. And then, look at the resources that we're putting in the comments, or look online. There are a lot of different ways that you can get involved with others, and it can be something pretty simple, and try it out and see. But definitely don't feel bad that you're feeling lonely. We all should have those connections, and so acknowledge that in yourself, and try to take a step to address it, and also to see how you can help others who might be experiencing loneliness.
Right. I think it's okay to feel lonely, but go try to do something about it. Right.
Yeah.
We don't want anyone out there lonely, especially as you mentioned, some of the mental impacts of that. Dr. Christian-Herman, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. You're a wealth of information, and you do great work at the MindBody Medicine at Blue Shield. So thank you for making time today. This has been great.
Sure. Thank you so much. This was a great discussion. I appreciate it.
Of course, and thanks to all of you for tuning in and watching. I'm Karina Nova here at ABC 7 News, and you can look for more programs like this one on the Blue Shield of California Facebook page. Have a safe and happy holiday. Thanks again.